As many of you are aware, since 2005, KnowledgeWorks has been forecasting the future of education, bringing insights from the field of strategic foresight to the education sector. And in case you're not aware, strategic foresight is a professional field that helps people anticipate significant changes that lie ahead and influences changes to achieve their long-term goals. So today, we're going to frame some challenges and opportunities on the horizon by drawing from our new forecast, Imagining Liberatory Education Futures. We invite you to use the chat to exchange ideas as we go along. If you're just now joining us, feel free to pop your name, where you're from, and your role in the chat so we can all meet one another. And there'll be several moments where Katie and I will invite you to put specific reflections in the chat box too. If you have questions for us that you specifically want to make sure we see and attend to as possible during the question and answer period, please put those in the Q&A box. So before we get into exploring the possibilities raised by our new forecast, we'd like to invite you to warm up to the topic and conversation by answering this prompt in the chat. What's something that makes you hopeful about the future? I'm seeing AI, specific partnership, young people, how they challenge us and inspire us to take action, the increasing foundation of pre-K that many young children are getting. Thanks for sharing those thoughts. And if others have ones to share, I'll invite you to continue putting those in the chat. So we focused this forecast on liberatory education because we've seen so much inertia over the years in education and other social systems. And there's just been increasing awareness of how deeply inequities are baked into those systems. So we know there are all too predictable outcomes in education. And we decided that it was time with this forecast to take a pointed look at what it might mean to make education systems truly equitable. So we asked ourselves, to what extent might education systems be liberatory and unconstrained by systems and structures of oppression? And to help ourselves answer this question in a credible and informed way, we collaborated with a diverse group of people to help create the forecast and guide the process. We looked out to the year 2040 to explore this question too, so that we'd have a good runway for imagining how things might be different than they are today. And as we did so, we came to emphasize the importance of working together to imagine new possibilities for education. That's because we have to imagine what we want for the future of learning before we can make it real. This model, called the 3 Horizons, visualizes the role of foresight in helping us articulate what we'd like to see, and then begin bringing our visions of the future to life. So a forecast, such as the one we're exploring today, can help us get clearer about what might happen, what we'd like to see, how we'd like to take forward the values that we care about, the things we're pursuing in the world across a variety of possible futures. And at the same time, it helps us think about what we want to keep from the present, what we want to take into the future with us, and also what we want to leave behind. But it invites us to think about making that transition be not just gradual because the passage of time requires it, but intentional because we can shepherd the current system, the current way we're doing things in education and elsewhere carefully, while we're seeding some strategies that help us bridge between how things are today and what we ideally would like to see in the future, and then planting some seeds through strategies that will start building those new future possibilities and giving them shelter until they can be more fully realized. So as we engage with future possibilities today, I invite you to consider how they might help you consider what you want for the future, for that 3rd horizon in this model, and what strategies might help you and others move toward that today, either kind of near term or in that middle 2nd horizon space. And if we don't spend time looking ahead in this way, considering what might happen and what we want, we risk letting inertia weigh us down. The pull of the present, or the status quo, is strong, and we have to work intentionally to make deep shifts. And any attempt to imagine the future of learning has to take into account the context in which education could be taking place. The forecast describes 3 big disruptions that are contributing to an era shift. They've been detailed by futurist Leah Zaidi and surfaced by other futurists as well. And these disruptions are shaping our experiences already today and promise to impact the next 20 years and beyond. Accelerating technologies, which include the advancement and proliferation of artificial intelligence and automation, are reshaping the ways we work and communicate, and even what it means to be human. They're introducing new possibilities and also the potential for new risks, such as biases being coded into the technologies that we use. The climate crisis, which is triggered by human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels, is in turn raising questions about what places will remain livable and what people might do to curtail ecological collapse. And it might seem far away from education, but the climate crisis will impact where and how people can live, the stressors that children and families face, and the ways schools can operate. We're already seeing climate migration taking place around the world and within the United States. Lastly, the fight for just societies throughout much of the world, which is made more urgent by the decline of functioning democracies, is calling into question the role of government and what it could mean to live in a society where each person were truly free. So this struggle is exemplified by the recent presidential election in France and by the war in Ukraine. And in the US, this fight has been manifesting through the renewed movement for racial justice, along with serious concern over the state of our democracy, which the Economist Intelligence Unit has rated as a flawed one. This era is presenting people around the world with shared existential challenges. And in the context of this era shift, we argue that we need to pursue fundamental systemic change, that education systems need to shift focus from equity to liberation. If we simply seek to make our current education systems more equitable, we'll be working to provide learners with the supports and means to succeed in a system that resists change. So we would be putting undue burden on the learners themselves, especially those who come from historically marginalized yet resilient communities, to navigate a rigid system whose underlying structures are oppressive, instead of looking at how we might change those structures in order to support everyone better, in order to promote goals related to liberatory education. When we talk about making education systems liberatory, this is what we mean, drawing on the work of activist Raphael Randall, as well as that of educator Zaretta Hammond. So liberatory education would be rooted in self-determination and the right to participate in shaping the world. It would also prioritize both individual and collective human potential and promise. As Raphael Randall describes it, we would see liberatory education valuing many ways of knowing and being, while preparing students to participate in and shape the current and future economy and civil society. Promoting that self-determination I mentioned, learning experiences would encourage high levels of agency for both learners and educators. And learning environments and curricula would be able to adapt easily to be relevant to the changing times. In addition, liberatory education would combine the science of learning and human development along with culturally responsive instruction. So as Zaretta Hammond explores, liberatory education systems would use evidence-based educational practices such as these while treating differences and children's experiences outside of school as assets. These systems would help historically marginalized yet resilient students who are underserved engage in deeper learning. That would mean helping students learn how to learn in addition to imparting grade level content. Students would lead their own learning. And liberatory education systems would go beyond simply reconsidering how and where teaching and learning happened, to examine what knowledge was taught and who created it. We will be exploring this topic further with Raphael Randall in a follow-up webinar on June 9th. But for now, I'm curious what comes to mind for you as you consider the definition of liberatory education that I shared. And again, I'll invite you to share your thoughts in the chat box. Learner agency is standing out. It's a comment that liberatory education takes personalized learning in a new direction. The focus on anti-oppression. It also takes diversity, equity, inclusion efforts to the next level. There's the idea that every child and learner is valued and believes they matter and feels that the adults who teach them matter in the system too. Michelle, I see your comment about how liberation does not require the subjugation of another to be free. I think I would agree with that. It's an inclusive definition, but prioritizes marginalized communities and students. So I'm seeing how some of you are seeing how the definition of liberatory education is building on things that exist today, like our current efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, our current efforts to pursue personalized learning, but pushing further, kind of setting a new horizon that picks up on some of the things we already value, but continues to challenge the system to do better by kids and by the adults who work in education. As we look at possibilities for liberatory education in the year 2040, we see two critical uncertainties. We think that these uncertainties will shape the future, but we don't yet know how they'll unfold. These critical uncertainties are big drivers of change whose direction is unclear. The first of these has to do with the level of social cohesion that will or will not exist in 20 years. This uncertainty explores the extent to which people will recognize one another's humanity, foster interconnection and respect, and be willing to work across differences for mutual well-being. So will we see people foster trust across groups or promote division and fear of difference? Will those who have enjoyed relative social privilege work to maintain the status quo or choose to engage in dismantling oppressive systems? So this uncertainty really asks questions about the degree to which we'll be willing to and able to cross lines of difference to pursue a shared future for the belief in something bigger than ourselves. If we have high levels of social cohesion, we're likely to see high levels of connection and trust among people, both within and across groups, respect for one another's differences, the space for anyone to voice their needs and contribute in their unique way. And with low social cohesion, there would be a lack of connection and trust, fear of difference, and it would be clear whose voices and contributions mattered and whose did not. The second critical uncertainty looks at how responsive public institutions might be in 20 years. It explores the extent to which public institutions, including education, but other kinds as well, will recognize the needs and demands of their constituents and share power in creating solutions. So this isn't about how quickly they respond, but it's about the nature of the response. And we know that public institutions like education have many, many constituents or stakeholders, some of whom are directly affected by what happens in schools day to day, and some, such as employers and people who live in a place, who are indirectly affected by its outcomes. And this uncertainty is really exploring the dynamics around the institution's relationships with that wide range of constituents or stakeholders. So will public institutions be building mutual trust with their constituents, or will they erode it? Will they share power and responsibility, or will they hoard them? We might, if we have high responsiveness, we're likely to see institutional agreements and the responsiveness, the plans and approaches put in place dynamically evolve with constituents and partners' feedback and needs. And if we have low responsiveness, we're likely to see more rigid institutional agreements that are imposed without feedback, more hoarding of power, lack of trust. So again, I'm curious what you're seeing this time in relationship to the critical uncertainties. And I'll invite you to share any examples of things you see happening in the world at large or in your local place, whatever the scale comes to mind for you. What examples are you seeing that relate to the critical uncertainties? And it can be helpful to think about those uncertainties extremes when we try to find things that are happening today that relate to them. So you're seeing examples of high social cohesion, maybe on a micro scale, maybe on a bigger scale. Are you seeing examples of low social cohesion? Again, are you seeing examples of high institutional responsiveness or low institutional responsiveness? And it's relatively easy these days to think of examples of the negative aspects, but so bonus points if you can identify examples of the positive sides. See, one example shared already, a lack of trust between parents, community, and public institutions. Both extreme reactions of groups during school board meetings and thoughtful co-creation of student advisory groups. And I think that example highlights how these uncertainties are uncertain because we're seeing pulls in both directions of each one of them. Seeing the need to transform education visibly to counter the current efforts to delegitimize it. Seeing stronger movements around things like mutual aid groups and resource sharing, as well as looking to those in radical disability movements for leadership and guidance. Great micro level example of institutional responsiveness about helping kids see that they matter, and then redesigning the rest of the year to focus on mental health over grades. And these examples help illustrate how the seeds of the future exist in the present. And when we're exploring a terrain like possibilities for liberatory education, we can see the seeds of a range of future possibilities in the present, and then help project out to see, well, how might they grow or wane? What could that mean for what education in general and liberatory education specifically look like in 2040? So with that, I'll pass to you, Katie, to take us through more exploration of what liberatory education might look like.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to all of you who have already shared some of your thoughts in the chat. My experience with this forecast so far is that I learn something new about it every time we talk to people about it. So please keep those thoughts and insights coming, because they're really interesting for us as well. So the way that we approached this forecast was to, as Catherine said, explore these critical uncertainties. Take a look. We know these things will affect the future, but we don't know yet how. And then we created scenarios about them, reflecting different combinations of those critical uncertainties. So if we have high social cohesion and high responsiveness of public institutions, as an example, what would liberatory education, what could it look like in that combination? So scenarios are basically stories about possible futures. They're not things that we say are definitely going to happen, or even things that we necessarily want to happen. In fact, there's a wide range, and all of us can look at them, explore them, and find things that we may want to enable, things that we may want to prevent. And that's really their purpose, is to help us think about a wide range of what might come to pass, and then ask ourselves how we might be able to pursue our visions and hold on to our values no matter what kind of future emerges. So I'm going to give you an overview of the 4 scenarios we created, really high level. And the idea here is not for you to digest every detail or come away with really a full understanding. We do have the full forecast for you to read and think about in your own time. But today, I'd like you to just pay attention to what are your first responses as you're hearing about these 4 scenarios. What's landing and in what way? Are there things that sound interesting that you might want to think about or explore further? Are there things that kind of hit you? Wow, that sounds really difficult. I may need to sit with that and think about it a little bit more. And also note your questions, because we will have some time to explore those as well. So I'm going to do a quick overview and just invite you to see what stands out to you as I'm sharing the high level description of these 4 scenarios. So as I said, we crossed the uncertainties and came up with these 4 scenarios. And I'm going to start in the upper left-hand corner with education, liberation, commons grow at the speed of trust. So this is a story about a future in which we have high levels of social cohesion combined with low public institution responsiveness. So what that means is we're in a very different place socially in this future than we are today. These scenarios look 20 years out. So we're thinking a lot of change has happened in the social arena in these scenarios. In this one, people are coming together across lines of difference and really embracing our interconnectedness and our shared future, as Catherine mentioned before. At the same time, public institutions are stuck in old ways of thinking, including public education systems. So when we look at what liberatory education might look like in this kind of future, we see people coming together to connect and build thriving liberatory education networks. But they're doing that really without the support of the public school system or other public institutions. So one key feature of this future is this idea of the education liberation commons. So that's teaching and learning resource networks that serve as an alternative to rigid institutional structures that aren't recognizing or serving people's needs. So a local region might have an education liberation commons, which would be this cooperative network of community agencies, services, learning resources, tutors, community elders. I saw that mentioned in the chat. They're really in this scenario, we're thinking of all of the people in the community coming together to help build vibrant learning environments and experiences to promote critical consciousness, encourage social action, and really prioritize and center the needs of learners who have been underserved and marginalized by the traditional education institutions. So in this scenario, we see public education systems kind of in a passive role. They're coasting, maintaining the status quo, continuing to focus on academics in a traditional way, and using traditional pedagogy. And while some schools have implemented project-based learning or personalized competency-based learning, states and districts remain really divided in the extent to which curriculum is culturally responsive and which school cultures are really trying to be anti-racist, anti-oppressive. So schools are more equitable than in the past, but they are not liberatory in this scenario. I'm going to go down to, I'm going to go counterclockwise here and now speak to liberatory education thrives in microstructures, which is a scenario where we see low social cohesion and low responsiveness of public institutions. So this is a future in which trust and connection has really eroded among individuals, communities, and between people and the institutions that are meant to be serving them. So this combination of unresponsive institutions and social disconnection really encourages people to retreat, just to be in homogenous groups, really being with people who they immediately align with. We really have few public communal experiences in this future, and a lot of public services have been heavily automated, creating this really transactional feeling society. Groups are self-focused. Everyone is really just trying to get by. There's a sense of scarcity and a sense of fear, which is leading even affluent and privileged people to gate themselves off, figuratively and literally. And then those who are less affluent and have less social privilege are really focused when they're most immediate community and family to find solutions to their educational, health, transportation, and other needs. Public education in this scenario is really crumbling, and many children and youth are simply not going to school in the way that we think about it today. But they don't stop learning. There are, in this scenario, we envisioned hyperlocal micro education structures that people and communities are using to meet their academic and developmental needs. The underground education and liberation movement. So these microstructures, they are micro but mighty. And in this scenario, students, families, educators, mayors, even in some cases, are leading efforts in cities and towns to support these small efforts. Tiny schools, learning collectives, student-led forums that are providing learning experiences that center liberation. Moving across to scenario D, economic-driven pathways bypass liberation. So in this scenario, we see low social cohesion with a high responsiveness of public institutions. So this is an interesting dynamic here because public institutions are working, they're trying to serve their constituents, but the level of fragmentation and the lack of cohesion in society makes it really difficult for them to prioritize and to know what and who to respond to. So this situation has created this kind of noisy power vacuum that's allowed the loudest institutional voices to take control of the social policy agenda, particularly education. And in this scenario, we thought, what if that loudest voice belonged to business and economic interests? And so we explored this idea of public education taking direction really almost exclusively from employers and economic interests, as it's trying to navigate resource constraints and trying to accommodate the diverse and competitive family and community group needs. So students have busy, full educational lives, and things are more standardized in this scenario, in this future, than they would be today. One feature of this future are teachers are required to rely on adaptive platforms as a foundation for their instruction, trying to get all of those skills that employers are looking for passed on, and making sure that employers can know that those things are being taught. An interesting dimension of this scenario is that large employers are championing equity strategies in this scenario. They see closing the achievement gap among historically marginalized yet resilient groups and equipping each graduate with necessary work skills as key strategies. They are promoting certain aspects of whole child approaches and social emotional learning. So while some meaningful equity work has been done and milestones have been achieved, there's a limit to how far they can go, because in this scenario, all of that work is grounded in a desire to grow and serve the economy, not so much in a desire to help communities thrive and allow individuals within those communities to practice self-agency and self-determination. So we're seeing progress in certain ways, but the underlying motivation of why education systems may have moved to a more equitable place is different, and certainly not centering the needs and aspirations of the young people themselves. And so in this scenario, families of color and caregivers of children with special needs really feel stuck in a system that narrowly attends to kids' academic needs, but doesn't inspire or affirm them as whole people. Moving up to scenario B, this is care-based ecosystems provide vibrant social infrastructures. And this is a scenario where we see high levels of social cohesion and high levels of responsiveness from public institutions. So we see people embracing their interconnectedness. Institutions have found ways to respond to diverse needs of communities. Now, not everything is perfect in this scenario, of course, but mindsets and systems are in place that allow people to find their common ground, to navigate conflict in healthy ways, to work together. And institutions have shifted their systems to be able to flex to meet a wide range of needs. In this future, we really see a paradigm shift at the level of the education systems and in society. Taking care of one another is really the work of society and of institutions in this scenario. And so education becomes integrated into this larger care-based system that really serves as that vital social infrastructure that's kind of holding everything together. Most public institutions see themselves as catalysts responsible for sparking dialogue and understanding across diverse groups and organizations. And these institutions really operate as learning organizations rather than compliance-oriented or knowledge-disseminating bureaucracies. And they're continually learning and continually seeking to improve the ways in which they hold up human dignity. The people that make up these and constituents that make up these communities are really focused on dismantling oppressive conditions and systems and investing in structures that uplift each student and foster their sense of social belonging. So in this scenario, schools, communities, public institutions, educators, community members really partner to co-create culturally relevant learning experiences that are delivered through learner-focused ecosystems. So each scenario kind of brings up insights, ideas, emotions, questions, and I invite you to hold those. And I see some things in the chat and definitely want to invite you to continue to share and process. But we also can look across the scenarios and see how they fit together and think about what seeing these four possibilities next to one another can make us think about. So I'm going to give you a moment to just review this slide, but just to tell you what you're looking at here. Each row in this table represents one of the scenarios that I just went through, and each column looks at highlights of what we see happening. So in that first column, the status of liberatory education just gives us a snapshot of, in that scenario, where does it stand? In the second column, we can see the power dynamic. So in that scenario, how are decisions being made and by whom? And then in the third column, we see the potential for liberatory education to spread, meaning what mechanisms would be in place that would allow education that prioritizes self-determination and human potential and promise to grow. So take a minute just to take this in, and then I'll share some of what stands out to me as I look across the four scenarios. So when I look at this chart and think about the scenarios together as a whole, what I notice is that in each of these scenarios, there is work that can be done and there is work to be done. We don't have a scenario in which we've kind of checked the box. We have liberatory education and it's complete. The relationships and structures that allow it to exist in any of these scenarios will require nurturing and continued attention and evolution. And the scenarios where liberatory education feels really far away have opportunities to leverage. There are things that are happening that could spread and grow. So just like today, the future will require our active participation if we hope to see it grow in the direction that we want. So at this point, we will give you a chance to just process anything that's standing out to you from either the individual scenarios or looking across them. You may have had sort of a range of emotional responses to those. You may have questions, which is great. We will have some time to focus on those a little bit later, but invite you just to share what's standing out, and we can see where.
Katie, one question that's already come up in the chat that might be helpful to speak to while folks are gathering their thoughts is how, if you could explain how the spread of liberatory education by word of mouth in scenario C, microstructures one, is different from its spread through individuals in the economic driven pathway scenario in D.
Mm-hmm. I can talk about how I think of that, but Catherine, I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts and if anyone else has other ideas. So I see scenario D still being fairly top down, and so there are individuals who can sort of move things forward. Word of mouth to me feels a little more organic. People are hearing this is happening over here. Would you like to come join us? So in neither of those ways are they sort of systemic and happening in a way, a structural way, but it's more it's individual in each case, but it's kind of at what level is that happening? So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's similar to what I think of it. There's more kind of word of mouth networking with the microstructures, and then with the big focus in scenario D on economic driven pathways, then it's like if an individual or their family wants to seek out liberatory education, they're kind of more on their own.
And I saw a really interesting thread in the chat as well about what do we need to let go of if we are hoping for any scenario to emerge, any future to emerge. What are we going to need to stop doing and let go of? And I think the 3 horizons model that you introduced at the beginning, Catherine, is a really interesting way to think about that. What's true and real today, that first horizon, and then when we look at the 3rd horizon, what isn't there anymore? What have we had to let go of? And there are a lot of things that we would be happy to let go of, I'm sure, as we think about what we want for the future. But there are also some things that it might be painful to let go of and to stop doing. And identifying those now and starting to think about what's going to be our process for sort of moving away from this thing that either people like or that feels useful, but ultimately maybe holding us back, I think is a really important process, and one of the ways that scenarios can be helpful, because it allows us to think about, okay, in this scenario, we really couldn't be doing this, we couldn't have this process anymore. So how do we start on the path of letting go of that? So thank you for bringing that up. Any other responses or thoughts? Please continue to keep the chat going and adding your thoughts. And again, if you have specific questions, we can also address those later. But anytime we create scenarios, we go into the future, but we do that for a specific purpose. It's to help us ask, what do these possibilities mean for us? What do we need to start grappling with today? What do we need to enable? What do we need to let go of? So the questions that are already coming up are exactly where we hope scenarios can take us and what they can help us think about. So identifying current tensions and dilemmas can help inform that leap of, we're in this first horizon now, we want to move to the second or even the third. What is it that we need to start dealing with? So I'll share a few that came up as we were working on the forecast and as we were reflecting on the scenarios, but certainly there are many that would come up as you think about these ideas in your own contexts. So as we look across the scenarios, we really came to realize that developing social cohesion is a prerequisite for moving towards broader systemic transformation. And I see a comment about that in the chat right now. It feels really hard to envision how do we get to social cohesion. But if we know that looking across the scenarios that the scenarios in which social cohesion is not there, we really are not getting to the state of education that we want to have, then we know we need to begin working on that. We can't rely on institutional responsiveness alone. And so identifying that, though that opens up a lot of questions of how do we get there, at least we can identify the social cohesion element feels really important. We also kind of noticed as we're thinking about the implications for today is that liberatory education strategies are going to need to evolve over time and reflect local conditions. There's not one way to do this, and there's not one path forward. It's going to really need to be co-created and really contextual based on where we are, what's happening in the environment, and what's going on in any given community. This third bullet point about not either or, it's both and, was a really interesting insight that came up in our work with our collaborators in creating this, that often we feel this tension of we can't, or we just don't feel like we have the time or the luxury to think about long-term transformation because there's so much that needs to happen urgently today to just reduce harm for what is happening to people. And that is absolutely true. And so we can think about what are the actions that we can take that can provide immediate relief and really stop doing the harm that systems and people are doing to one another, while also aiming to disrupt those systemic patterns and really think about that longer work of transformation. So what are the actions and the steps we can take that can do both at the same time? And that can begin to inform our path forward. we really need to look at creating counter narratives to some of the narratives that are out there right now that are harmful about teaching and learning, about young people, about communities, and really amplify voices that have other perspectives on knowledge, freedom, teaching, and learning than maybe what's in the mainstream, and the narratives that are supporting the harmful structures that we see right now. Attention to digital technologies can address issues of access in today's education system. So we can think about technology in a way that helps us understand what are some new behaviors around teaching and learning, and what are things that we can do that can foster new types of connections and relationships. We've certainly seen ways that technologies can be biased, can contribute to marginalization. And so can we flip that on its head and think about what would it look like if they instead were channeled for liberation, enabling new sources of knowledge, enabling new connections, new ways for learners to show what they know. So these are just a handful of the tensions and dilemmas that education stakeholders like yourselves will need to address as you work to shape the future of learning. And we certainly invite you to think of your own and start to grapple with what this might mean for your work. So right now, we'd like to continue to invite you to share in the chat. If you have specific questions that you would like us to answer, we can put those in the Q&A box, which there's a button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll see that that's really something that you want to share and have us respond to as you process these scenarios and think about what they may mean for your work.
And maybe Katie, to get us started while folks think on that, one question that came up in the chat was that it's so hard to imagine possible pathways towards social cohesion, given how fragmented and frayed things are right now, and especially taking it as far as going to the care-based ecosystems scenario. So, like, what might we imagine as being some possible pathways? And one of the places my mind goes is a very basic sounding but difficult one is learning to listen to one another more, like practicing listening to people with different perspectives before reacting would be a micro level kind of action that might help do some healing toward that kind of possibility. Curious what comes to mind for you as well.
Yes, and I think the word that you used, healing, there is also an important component, and not that that's straightforward either, but feels really critical. And one that we put was, we were exploring what would it look like to have high social cohesion. It's really being able to acknowledge harm that has happened in the past. What are the things that are keeping us from coming together? And that's obviously a very tall order that many people have been working on for generations, to just be able to have the truth of harm that has been done to someone, allowing people to share. This has been my experience, and like you said, listening, a willingness to listen for that. For me, I think a lot about the work of Adrienne Maree Brown. If any of you are familiar, I encourage you to check her out. But she talks a lot about how what we do at the small scale reflects in the big scale, and that's really right now the only way that I can think about social cohesion, because it also really feels like a tough and critical area. And so, what are the ways that we can practice social cohesion? What are the ways that we can practice connection, listening in the smallest, in our relationships, in our workplaces, with our own children? Because as we practice those things on the small scale, we learn how to take them, and we see opportunities to carry them forward out into the world. I'm a person who sees, okay, here's this big problem, what's the big solution? And I think right now, working at the small scale is where we have the most influence. And this is a topic that, as we've talked with folks about this forecast, that keeps coming up. So it's certainly going to be an area that we are continuing to pay attention to, and hearing what others are saying as far as what the path forward is in social cohesion.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say Michelle's point of holding justice, love, compassion, generosity, and forgiveness in every opportunity that we have, individually, local, social. So can we model that for ourselves and for others? I think is something that we all have in our capacity to do, even though it is challenging and doesn't always feel like enough.
Another question, maybe more for our collective reflection than for us specifically, that's in the chat, is an observation of how critical narratives are, and then what might be some key elements that could be part of a narrative that would grow social cohesion. And one thing I think about in that regard is to thinking about common values that we might have as people in relation to enduring human needs. So that's not necessarily an easy common ground to identify again, but I imagine there would be some in most situations that we could identify, and especially if we think less of the immediate moment and think about kind of fundamental human needs. Is there a way we could hold those in mind and find ways to design toward those, or to talk about how we might develop social cohesion, co-create solutions around those needs for a future that's going to be very different than than the present that exists today, and then the multiple presents that exist for different people.
I also think about narratives. It's I think a first step is just identifying what are the narratives that are at play, and what sort of actions or policies or processes are they allowing to exist. Because a lot of times we just see that something's in place, but if we can understand what's the narrative that makes that seem like a good idea. So when we think about the comment earlier about, okay, we have sort of grades and an education system that's around ranking and sorting, what is the narrative that makes that seem like the best way to do this, the best way to help people learn and grow? And when we unpack that, we can start to see what's underneath that, and then what would be an alternative? What's another story that we could tell, a narrative we could hold about the best ways for people to learn and grow, and begin there. So I think some unpacking and then repacking is just a process that we can go through, because I find when I do that, I can sort of dig into, okay, here's what's appealing about maybe this narrative that's enabling this thing I don't like. Is there something equally appealing that we could tell a story around in an alternative?
Mm-hmm. There's a question in the Q&A box as to how KnowledgeWorks anticipates shaping or shifting our engagement model to help accelerate transformation in directions we want. I would say we are probably still working through that, given how new this forecast is. But if I think specifically around this work versus KnowledgeWorks work overall, I think challenging ourselves to partner with folks who have different experiences than we do, working with different lived experiences or possibilities related to liberatory education, to co-create different kind of engagement arcs or workshop designs than we might have used in the past. I think is one of the things that we're thinking about, so that we're challenging our own practice of helping people explore what future possibilities could mean for them. Katie, is there anything you'd add there?
No, I think that is, we're on this journey with you all of saying, here are some ideas that we envisioned, and what are we now going to do with them as an organization, I think as individuals, and with our partners. So we put these ideas out there and then start to grapple with them and work with them in the same ways that that all of you are. So I think, as you said, Catherine, a lot of that is to be determined, and we're certainly talking about it internally, externally. What implications does this raise for our work?
Michelle put a comment in the chat: if we believe there are no throwaway people, then what do we want our learning institutions to look like, sound like, feel like? And I think that kind of question in the realm of belief or mindset is a nice way of challenging ourselves to think differently about what the future could look like. It's it's always, I think, helpful when we're looking at the future to ask those kinds of what if questions. But when we're getting to the ones that are shifting, like what if we believed this, what if we believe that, then we're getting to a deeper layer in terms of systems thinking, where we can really start to see some possibilities that might be pretty different from how things work today.
Yeah, a totally different narrative around where does people's value come from, and why do we value human dignity as an inherent as something that everyone has, and how would we honor that, and what would institutions look like if we did, I think is a really powerful question that we can explore. Well, our forecast opens with a bell hooks quote: "What we cannot imagine cannot come into being." And so we just really thank you for being here, for offering your imaginations to help bring forward a new kind of system where all learners are free and have the agency to shape their own lives and the world around them. So thank you, as I said, for being on this journey with us, and we look forward to continuing to work together towards the future. And please feel free to reach out. Our contact information is here. We hope to see you all at our June 9th webinar with Raphael Randall, where we can dig more into what do we mean by liberatory education and where do we begin. So thank you all so much for your participation and engagement today. And we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.